on the attributes of God. Last week we started to look at the omniscience of God. We want to continue with that. In Psalm 147, verses 4 and 5, He telleth the number of the stars, He calleth them all by their names. Great is our Lord, and of great power. His understanding, which would be a part of His omniscience, is infinite. As we saw last week, when we think of the omniscience of God, it comes down to this. What does God know? What does God know? Or you can look at it the opposite way. What does He not know? Well, of course, He knows everything. There's nothing He does not know. God knows everything. Now, when we think of that, there's really a twofold aspect of that. You could consider them separately, but we won't. There's the knowledge of God, what He knows, which is everything. And then there's the wisdom of God, which you could consider separate as an attribute of God, but we're going to include it in the omniscience of God. And the wisdom of God is really the right use of His knowledge. And knowledge can be a very dangerous thing if there's no wisdom, if you do not know how to use that knowledge. And that's proven over and over and over in humanity, how knowledge often is misused because of a lack of wisdom. But God knows everything, and God will always use His knowledge properly or righteously or according to His nature. So omniscience is His perfect and eternal knowledge and His perfect and eternal use of that knowledge. Again, Ephesians 1:11, He worketh all things after the counsel of His own will. He knows His own will perfectly, and He works that out. That's His wisdom. So the omniscience of God is declared all through Scripture. We saw last week, His knowledge is distinct. That is, there's no darkness in His knowledge. There's nothing unclear to God. His knowledge is infallible. There's no error in His knowledge. God never says, well, if I would have only known that, then I would have done such and such. That's of man, that's not of God. God's knowledge is infallible. God's knowledge is immutable. Does not change. Doesn't know any more today than He did in the beginning. His knowledge is immutable. It's eternal, which goes along with His immutable, with the immutability of His knowledge. His knowledge is independent. That is, He knows because He's God. He does not receive His knowledge from any outside source. You and I receive knowledge from outside sources. God does not receive knowledge. God does not need information. He knows because He is God. Concerning His wisdom, He's, of course, perfectly wise. He's perpetually wise. He's incomprehensibly wise. So we look at the omniscience of God, we want to consider the extent of this. Again, omni means all. That explains the extent of his knowledge. His knowledge, of course, is all inclusive. It knows no variation. There is no variation in the knowledge of God. All the contingent elements of everything he knows. He knows. And he knows the relation between all things. Again, Romans 8:28, all things work together. God knows the relation of those things, and all things have a relation in the mind and in the workings of God. So, God knows. First of all, God knows himself. He's the only one who does completely, perfectly know himself. Now that says a lot because God is infinite. And you and I don't know everything about ourselves. There's people that think they do. You don't even come close. No one's even close. And we're finite. God is infinite. And God perfectly knows himself. Now, if he perfectly knows infinity, then it goes without saying that God perfectly knows us who are finite. It would be utter foolishness to say, well, God knows what's infinite, but he does not know what's finite. That's contrary. That contrary to one another. So God knows himself. He knows himself perfectly. He knows the knowledge of God and the nature of God are, again, both infinite, and God knows. Notice in 1 Corinthians chapter 2, 1 Corinthians 2, verse 11. For what man knoweth the things of man, save the spirit of man which is in him? Even so, the things of God knoweth no man. Knoweth no man. Doesn't matter who that man is. But the Spirit of God. The Spirit of God knows God. God perfectly knows himself. People say all the time, well, I know myself. No, you don't. No, you don't. If you did, you wouldn't have an ounce of pride. Man does not know himself. He knows some things about himself. And those are through his own lens, which there's a problem there as well. So man does not perfectly know himself. God does, and God perfectly knows himself. He knows his creation. You and I do not know, nor do scientists know, everything that God has created. Man will never know everything that God has created. But God knows his creation. And he knows everything about his creation. And he perfectly knows his creation. He knows everything there is to know about a speck of dust. What do you and I know about a speck of dust? Very little. We don't even care. But God knows everything there is to know about just a speck of dust. Notice in 1 Chronicles 28, 1 Chronicles 28 and verse 9. And now, Solomon, my son, know thou the God of thy father. Serve him with a perfect heart and with a willing mind. For the Lord searcheth all hearts, and understandeth. He knows. Understanding is part of his knowledge. It's comprehension. understandeth all the imaginations of the thoughts. Now, that says more than God knows all your thoughts. He comprehends all the imaginations of the thoughts. He knows exactly why you think what you think. He knows what you would have thought even though you didn't think it. He knows what you could have thought. So he knows everything about our thoughts. And Job 34, verse 21, his eyes are upon all the ways of man. He seeth all his goings, which is just another way of saying God knows. God knows. Psalm 50, verse 10 and verse 11. For every beast of the forest is mine, and so is the forest, and everything about the forest, and the cattle upon 1,000 hills. The hills are his too, and every blade of grass is his, and every speck of dirt on those hills. I know all the fowls of the mountains, and the wild beasts of the field are mine. He goes on, he says, if I were hungry, he isn't going to be, I would not tell thee. Why would he? You can't do anything about it. God knows. God knows. Psalm 94, verse 11. The Lord knoweth the thoughts of man, that they are vanity. Again, the Lord knoweth the thoughts of man. Psalm 139, verses 2 and 3. Thou knowest my down sitting. God knows when you sit down. He knows why you sit down. Thou knowest my down sitting and mine uprising. He knows when you sit down. He knows when you're going to sit down. He knows when you're going to sit down 15 years from now. He knows. And he knows when you get up. He doesn't just know it when you do it. He knows it now. Thou understandest my thought. There it is again. Afar off. That is before you even think it. God knows. God knows. And he knows why you think it. Thou compassest my path and my lying down, and art acquainted with all my ways. Then notice in Isaiah chapter 40, verse 26. Lift up your eyes on high, and behold, who hath created these things, that bringeth out their host by number. He calleth them all by names, by the greatness of his might, for that he is strong in power, not one faileth. So again, God knows. Jonah. God knew where the whale was. God caused the whale to swallow Jonah. God caused the whale to spit up Jonah. In Matthew chapter 10, Matthew 10, verse 30. But the very hairs of your head are all numbered. People have taken that verse and said, God knows how many hairs are on your head. Yes, he does. But that says more than that. It says much more than that. But the very hairs of your head are all numbered. They're numbered. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. Hairs fell out this morning. You don't even know how many. But God knows what number hair fell out. Maybe it was hair 1042. God knew. And he knows where hair 1,141 is. He numbers them. He numbers them. That's incomprehensible. Again, we've already seen numbers of the stars, same thing. It's not just that he knows how many there are, but each one has a number. And God knows everything there is to know about that hair. And he knows why it fell out. He knows how long it'll be on your head or your arm or wherever. He knows. He knows. Acts 15, verse 18. Acts 15, verse 18. Known unto God are all his works from the beginning of the world. What a statement. Known unto God are all his works. Think about those words, all his works. You and I hardly know any of them. But known unto God are all his works from the beginning of the world. From the beginning. He knows everything. The omniscience of God. He not only knows perfectly everything that he created, he knows everything he could have created, but didn't. God could have created a lot of things that he didn't create. He knows all that as well. He knows the rain. He knows the dew. Job 38, verse 29. Some of my favorite chapters there in Job. God asks Job hundreds of questions to show that God is sovereign. God knows all. And Job, I don't need you. And nor does he need us. Job 38, verse 29. Out of whose womb came the ice and the hoary frost of heaven? Who hath gendered it? He knows everything there is to know about the dew. He knows everything there is to know about the rain. He knows the ravens. He knows their young. Verse 41. Who provideth for the raven his food? When his young ones cry unto God, they wander for lack of meat. God knows. He knows everything there is to know about his creatures. He knows every bird of the air, Psalm 15, verse 11. He knows, again, as we've already seen, he knows the thoughts. Not only of man, he knows the thoughts of all creatures. He knows all the thoughts. Notice in Proverbs 16. Proverbs chapter 16. In verse 2. All the ways of man are clean in his own eyes, but the Lord weigheth the spirits. The Lord knows. The Lord knows. And then notice in Ezekiel chapter 11 and the 5th verse, Ezekiel 11. And verse 5. And the Spirit of the Lord fell upon me and said to me, Speak, thus saith the Lord. Thus have ye said, O house of Israel, for I know the things that come into your mind, every one of them. I know the things that come into your mind, every one of them. And again, he knows why. He knows why they came into your mind. Not only does he know what men do, he knows what they would have done had he not restrained them. A good example, there's several really, but Abimelech and Sarah. God told Abimelech, though Abimelech did the right thing, God told Abimelech, I know what you would have done had I not prevented you from doing it. Notice in Genesis 20 and verse 6. Genesis 20, verse 6. And God said unto him in a dream, Yea, I know that thou didst this in the integrity of thy heart, for I also withheld thee from sinning against me. Therefore suffered I thee not to touch her. He's saying is, you would have. You would have. But I stopped you. I know what you would have done had I not prevented you from doing it. You and I need to thank God for all the things that He has prevented us from doing. And God knows what we would have done had He not stopped us, had He not restrained us. People say, "Oh, I would never do that." Well, that's a statement of ignorance. It shows how little they know about human nature. Well, I would never do that. And you and I need to stop and think of all the things that we would have done, but we haven't. This is a preventive to self-righteousness. Well, I've never done that. Only because God stopped you. Only because God stopped you. I've never done that, and I would never do that. And then they get on their self-righteous kick. But all what we would have done had not God stopped us. And there's many examples in the Old Testament of that. So God also knows our every sinful act. And He knows every sinful act that He has kept us from. What this does is it magnifies the grace and the mercy of God. God knows our every departure. He knows every departure in our minds that we make from God. He knows every departure that He has kept us from. And He knows how far we would have gone had He not brought us back. Now think about that. How far we've all departed from God at times, and we still do. But how far would we have gone had He not brought us back? There's no telling. But God knows. God knows how far you would have gone had He not brought you back. God knows our every discouragement. He knows our every depression. And He knows how discouraged and depressed we would have been had He not intervened. He knows our every trouble. He knows our every sorrow. He knows every trouble and sorrow that we bring into our own lives and those that come into our lives. He knows every trouble and sorrow we would have brought into our life had He not spared us from doing so. So God's knowledge covers all things. Then there's God's wisdom. The wisdom of God appears in His purposes and His decrees. Everything God does, He does perfectly. You and I may not know why God does such and such. People are always asking, and it's a foolish question. It's really, when you even ask, you're on the border of blasphemy, at the least. Who are you to ask? Who are we to ask why God does something? As if we're the wise ones. Whatever God does, He does in wisdom. In Isaiah 25 and verse 1, Isaiah 25 and verse 1, O Lord, Thou art my God, I will exalt Thee, I will praise Thy name, for Thou hast done wonderful things. Thy counsels of old are faithfulness and truth. That's always so. God is always faithful. God is always true, no matter what He does. And everything He does, He's faithful, He's true, He's God. Everything. The wisdom of God appears in His works of creation. All around us are examples and manifestations of the wisdom of God. How creation works, how nature works, is a manifestation of the wisdom and the perfection of God. Notice in Psalm 136, Psalm 136, verse 5, to Him that by wisdom made the heavens. God made the heavens. God made everything by His wisdom. He didn't just throw things out there. Everything is made wisely. Proverbs chapter 3, verses 19 and 20. The Lord by wisdom hath founded the earth. By understanding hath He established the heavens. By His knowledge the depths are broken up, and the clouds drop down the dew. Jeremiah 10, verse 12. Jeremiah 10, verse 12. He hath made the earth by His power. He hath established the world by His wisdom, and hath stretched out the heavens by His discretion. When He uttereth His voice, there is a multitude of waters in the heavens. And He causeth the vapors to ascend from the ends of the earth. He maketh lightnings with rain, and bringeth forth the wind out of His treasures. And again, it's all by wisdom. All by the wisdom of God. The wisdom of God is seen in the variety of His creation. All the variety of the creation of God. Just the variety in plants, the variety in sea life. You look at some of the ugliest creatures on earth are in the sea. And the variety, and some of the most beautiful are in the sea. And the variety is just beyond our comprehension. Only God. And His wisdom is seen in all of that. And that man in his foolishness fails to remember when man talks about the earth and some of the crazy things they come up with, they have no understanding of the wisdom of God in creation. None whatsoever. We're not to abuse creation. We're not to abuse the earth. But people need to understand something. God is wise. And nature, God is the one that set the laws of nature. And He did so in His wisdom. and it will always be. It will always be. It appears in the usefulness of his creation. It's somewhat comical, humorous, when, did you know that man discovered that, man, these scientists, they're smart. This plant can be used for something. Really? You got to be kidding me. Why do you think God put it there? Read the creation account. God's creation is to be used by man. And man discovers what God has put there, and then he acts like he's the intelligent one. But his wisdom appears in the usefulness of his creation. Notice in Psalm 104. Psalm 104. Verse 3. Who layeth the beams of his chambers in the waters? Who maketh the clouds his chariot? Who walketh upon the wings of the wind? That's God making use of his own creation. In verse 14, he causeth the grass to grow for the cattle, and herb for the service of man. For the service of man, that he may bring forth food out of the earth. That's all the wisdom of God. The wisdom of God, of course, appears in his providence. God worketh all things together. That's the wisdom of God. Now, there's many practical applications, of course, to the wisdom of God. Or the omniscience of God. It should be of great comfort that God knows. That should comfort us. It should also humble us. God knows. God knows. You know, people say all the time in defense of themselves usually, well, God knows my heart. Oh, yes, he does. I'm sorry, but I don't think you can use that in your defense. I don't think you can ever use that in your defense. Not according to Jeremiah 17:9. So, God does know. So it ought to comfort us, but at the same time, it ought to humble us. God cannot be deceived. God cannot be deceived. The hypocrisy of man, God sees right through it all the time. God cannot be perplexed about any situation. God is not a reactionary God. God knows what he's going to do before you do it. He knows what he's going to do already. He knows. He knows all circumstances from the beginning to the end. The knowledge of God should, again, lead to sincerity. It should cause us not to play act. What's the point? He knows. What's the point of play acting? He knows. What's the point of lying to God? He knows. The omnipresence of God should encourage trust in him. Oh, how we ought to trust him. If we ever get a hold of the omniscience of God, or it gets a hold of us, you'll trust him. You'll trust him. It ought to cause us to have reverence for him and to just submit to him. He knows. He knows. How foolish. We have a God who knows everything, and we'll go to man who knows nothing for advice. God knows. Go to him first. Take great comfort. Trust him. Trust him. So like all the attributes of God, there are practical effects that ought to carry over into our lives. Next, we'll begin looking at the omnipotence of God. Let's look to the Lord in word of prayer. Heavenly Father,